The fiddle screamed to life on a Thursday night in Calico Creek, and Marcus Reed stood at the edge of the saloon floor with his hat pressed flat against his chest like a man holding a wound closed. It was the autumn of 1882, and Calico Creek, Texas, sat stubborn and sun-baked along the western edge of the Llano Estacado, a town that had grown from a single trading post and a dream someone had once been reckless enough to believe in. The main street was packed dirt and horse droppings, and the occasional ambitious plank of wood laid over the mud. The saloon, which went by the dignified name of the Golden Spur, was the beating heart of the place on any given weekend. But on the third Thursday of October, when the cattle drives had settled and the drovers were paid and the dust of the season was beginning to cool, it became something closer to a living thing. Marcus had been in Calico Creek for 3 weeks. Before that, he had been in Abilene. Before that, he had ridden south from somewhere he preferred not to name. He was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of saddle work and fence posts, with dark hair that curled slightly when the weather turned humid, and a jaw that looked like it had been set once by a doctor who was not entirely sober. He carried himself with the careful quietness of a man who had learned to take up less space than he physically occupied, which was a considerable effort given that he stood over 6 feet and had hands that could palm a water bucket. He was not a violent man. He had been, or close enough to it, in the years that no longer had names for him. But violence had a way of burning out if you were lucky and burning you out if you were not, and Marcus had been just lucky enough to walk away while there was still something left of him worth salvaging. He worked for a rancher named Earl Putnam, who was a fair enough employer and asked fewer questions than most, which Marcus appreciated more than he could have articulated. He ran fence line, repaired water troughs, helped bring in the late-season calves, and did all the necessary and unremarkable work that kept a ranch alive. He was good at it. He had always been good at practical things. What he had not been good at for 11 years now was standing inside a room where a fiddle was playing and a woman was laughing, and the world felt briefly like a place worth inhabiting, because those things together reminded him of a leaner, and a leaner was buried in a churchyard in New Mexico, and the grief of that had never entirely dried up, only calcified into something he carried rather than wept over. He had not cried in 8 years. He had not asked a woman to dance in 11. The first time he had not asked was the year a leaner died, 2 months after they buried her, when a neighbor woman had tried to draw him back into the world with a harvest dance, and he had stood exactly as he stood now, hat in hand, and understood with a cold and merciless clarity that he was not ready and possibly would never be. And then 1 year had become 2, and 2 had become 5, and 5 had rolled silently into 11, and somewhere in there the decision had stopped being a decision and had simply become a fact about him, the way the color of his eyes was a fact, or the scar along his left forearm from a barbed wire incident in 1876. He had not planned to come to the Golden Spur tonight. Earl Putnam's youngest boy, a cheerful 19-year-old named Colton, had badgered him with the particular relentlessness that only the young and the untouched possess, and Marcus had agreed mostly to make the noise stop. He had told himself he would have 1 drink, stand near the wall, and leave before the music started. He had been standing near the wall for 40 minutes, and the music had been going for 35 of them. He was about to leave when Ada Talbot walked in. She came through the door with the controlled energy of a woman who had somewhere to be and had chosen, after some deliberation, to be here instead. She was 27, though Marcus did not know that yet. She had dark auburn hair that she wore pinned up with the kind of casual competence that suggested she did it herself every morning without a mirror, and she wore a dress the color of tobacco leaves that had probably been washed until the original color was something you had to take on faith. She was not dressed for spectacle. She was not dressed to be noticed. She was dressed like a woman who had worked all day and had washed her face and come out anyway because the alternative was sitting alone in a room listening to the wind come down off the high plains, and she had done enough of that for one season. She was accompanied by a woman Marcus would later learn was named Helen Mace, who was the wife of the town's only dry goods store owner, and who had the forthright manner of someone who had decided long ago that life was too short for pretense. Helen was laughing before she fully cleared the doorway, and Ada was smiling at whatever had been said, and the smile was the kind that arrived a half-second behind the expression, like it had to travel from somewhere real before it reached her face. Marcus watched her the way a man watches something he has no intention of approaching, observationally, carefully, from a distance that kept it theoretical. Ada Talbot had come to Calico Creek 14 months ago, which made her a relative newcomer in a town where families measured themselves in decades. She had come from a town called Haskell, 2 days' ride east, where her father had run a small farm until a bad season and a worse debt had made that impossible. She had not come as a bride, which was the common assumption made by people who had not actually spoken to her, but as a woman who had heard that the schoolhouse in Calico Creek needed a teacher and who had the qualifications and the nerve to apply for the position. The school board, which consisted of 4 men who were all slightly afraid of women with opinions, had hired her after a conversation that was reportedly awkward on their side and completely composed on hers. She taught 22 children ranging in age from 6 to 14. She lived in a small house adjacent to the schoolhouse that the town provided, which was drafty in winter and hot enough in summer to bake bread on the windowsill, and she had made it as livable as her modest salary allowed. She had a cat named Biscuit who was missing one ear from a long-ago dispute with something larger than himself, and she had a kitchen garden, and she had a small collection of books that she treated with more care than most people treated their horses. She was, by all accounts, a practical woman, a sensible woman. A woman who had gotten herself to a new place and built something workable from nothing, and who was not waiting for anyone or anything to come along and rearrange the life she had made for herself. This was all true. It was also true that she had not been held by another person in longer than she cared to calculate, and that the nights on the high plains in October had a particular loneliness to them that even the most practical woman could feel in the small bones of her hands. Marcus Reed did not know any of this. He knew only what he could see from 20 feet away, which was a woman with an auburn-haired smile that arrived from somewhere real, and that was enough to make something shift in his chest with the slow, grinding reluctance of a door that has been closed so long the hinges have rusted. He turned away. He looked at his drink. He listened to the fiddle. The fiddle player was a Mexican man named Roberto Cruz, who had been playing at the Golden Spur for 6 years, and who played with the kind of loose-wristed joy that made people want to move whether they intended to or not. He had 2 other musicians with him tonight, a man on guitar and a boy of no more than 16 on harmonica, and together they made a sound that was part lament and part celebration, the way the best music usually is. People were dancing. The floor of the Golden Spur was not large enough for many couples, but enough were moving that the room had the feeling of something alive. Colton Putnam was already out there with a girl who worked at the laundry, spinning her in wide, enthusiastic circles that were more energy than technique. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Gus, was nodding his head in time while he poured whiskey with the practiced automatism of long habit. Ada was at the bar with Helen, not looking at the dance floor, engaged in what appeared to be a genuine conversation. Marcus was studying the middle distance. He was going to leave. He was absolutely going to leave. He set down his glass, settled his hat onto his head, and was turning for the door when he moved in exactly the wrong direction and found himself navigating around 2 men who had stepped back from the bar. And the navigation took him close enough to Ada Talbot that he could see the small crescent scar near her left eyebrow and the way her hands wrapped around her glass of cider. And then Helen Mace said something and laughed and leaned over to speak to a woman on her other side, and Ada was briefly alone in the small social way that happens at gatherings, and Marcus was standing close enough that the not speaking would have been more conspicuous than the speaking, and something in him that had been asleep for 11 years lurched upright like a man who has heard his name called in a crowd. He said, "Ma'am, I apologize for the intrusion." Ada turned and looked at him with the frank, assessing look of a woman who spends her days managing 22 children and has therefore become very good at reading people quickly. "No intrusion," she said. He was holding his hat in his hands again. He had not planned this. He had not planned any of this. He was going to leave, and instead he said, "My name is Marcus Reed. I work out at the Putnam Ranch." "Ada Talbot," she said. "I teach at the schoolhouse." "I know," he said, and then immediately felt the awkwardness of that. "Colton Putnam mentioned it. He speaks highly of you. He mentioned you refused to let him copy answers off Charlie Hines." Something that was not quite amusement moved across her face. "I still maintain that was the right call." "I expect it was," Marcus said. There was a pause. The fiddle surged into something faster, and Roberto Cruz closed his eyes with an expression of private delight. Marcus had been planning to leave. He had been planning to leave for the last hour. Something had shifted in the mechanism of his intentions. Some small gear that he had thought was rusted solid had moved, and now here he was, hat in hand, looking at a woman who was looking back at him with patient curiosity. He said, "I wondered if you might like to dance." The words came out without his full permission. He heard them as if someone else had produced them, and there was a half-second in which the room seemed very still around him despite the noise and the music and the movement on the floor. Ada looked at him. She looked at him with the careful attention she gave to something she had not entirely figured out yet. She said, "No, thank you." And that was it. Those 3 words. Said without cruelty, without malice, with a kind of straightforward gentleness that was somehow both better and worse than a sharper rejection would have been. She was not dismissing him. She was simply saying no. It was her absolute right to say no. It was the most sensible thing she could have said. Marcus felt the word land in the center of his chest like a stone dropped into still water. Felt the ripples move outward. He had not asked a woman to dance in 11 years. And the first time he tried, she had said no, and some part of him registered this with the grim recognition that this was simply what he deserved, that he had waited too long, that the part of him that could do this had atrophied beyond recovery. He could leave. He should leave. He had been planning to leave. He turned his hat over in his hands once, and then he looked at her again. She was still watching him. She was watching him with an expression that was waiting to see what he did next. He said, "I understand. And I don't mean to be a bother, but I would like to ask again if you'll permit it. Just the once more. And if you say no again, I'll wish you a good evening and get out of your way." There was something in his voice that he could not entirely control, something that sat just beneath the surface of the words, a kind of careful honesty that was not quite pleading and not quite desperation, but was something real and unguarded in a way that was rarer than most things in 1882 Texas. Ada Talbot studied him. She was a good reader of people. 22 children over 14 months and a lifetime before that had made her good at it. She read the lines around his eyes that suggested he did not laugh often but had once. She read the way he held his hat, not nervously but carefully, like it was something he was keeping safe. She read the quietness in him that was not coldness but something more like the quietness of a long winter that has been waiting for a particular reason to end. She said, "Yes." And Marcus Reed, who had not asked a woman to dance in 11 years, set his hat on the bar and offered his hand. And Ada Talbot looked at it for one moment and then placed her hand in his, and they walked out onto the floor of the Golden Spur, while Roberto Cruz's fiddle sang something that sounded like a question finally answered. He danced with the measured caution of a man who knows the steps, but is not certain his feet will cooperate. Ada danced with the straightforward competence she brought to most things. They were not a perfect pair on the floor. They were 2 people who were working something out through the medium of music, and the working out was apparent in the small adjustments they made, the slight recalibration of distance, The way his hand settled more naturally at her waist after the first minute, and the way she stopped holding her shoulders quite so level. They did not speak much during the dance. The music was loud enough to make conversation impractical, and besides, neither of them was looking for conversation just then. They were looking for the other thing, the thing that happens when two people move in the same direction at the same time and find that the world accommodates it. When the song ended, Marcus stepped back and said, "Thank you. You dance well enough," Ada said. "I haven't in a long time," he said. She looked at him again with that assessing quality. "How long?" He considered, not answering. Then he said, 11 years. Something moved across her face, a flicker of something that was not pity but was in the same family as understanding. She said, "That's a long time to wait." "It is," he said. Roberto Cruz launched into another song and the floor filled again around them. "Would you like another?" Marcus asked, and he was surprised to find that the asking was easier the second time, like a muscle that had seized had been briefly worked loose. Ada considered. "I would," she said. They danced twice more that night, and between dances they stood at the edge of the floor and talked with the careful, oblique conversation of people who are feeling out the shape of each other from a distance, testing for depth before committing weight. She told him about the school, about a boy named Samuel who was unnaturally gifted at mathematics, and a girl named Ruth who had memorized half of the McGuffey Reader and could recite it without pause. He told her about the Putnam Ranch, about the way the Llano Estacado looked in the early morning when the light came in flat and gold across the grass and turned everything briefly into something out of a painting. She did not ask him why he had not danced for 11 years, and he did not offer it, and the space around that unsaid thing was present between them but not uncomfortable, the way a room can be quiet without being cold. At the end of the evening, when Helen Mace was gathering her shawl and the crowd was thinning and Roberto Cruz had shifted to a slower, sleepier tune, Marcus walked with Ada to the door of the saloon and stopped. He said, "I'll be in town again Saturday if there's occasion." Ada looked at him. She said, "There usually is." He put his hat on. She went out with Helen into the cool October dark, and Marcus stood at the door of the Golden Spur and watched the stars over Calico Creek, which were very bright and very close in the way of stars over open country, and felt something move through him that was unfamiliar enough that he had to stand very still while it passed through, like a weather change. He was not a man who believed in signs. He was a man who believed in work and weather and the practical things that held a day together. But standing there under the October stars with the fiddle sound dying behind him, he thought that something had shifted in the world's arrangements, and that he was going to have to figure out what to do about it. He rode back to the Putnam Ranch in the dark with his horse, a steady gray mare named Patience, moving beneath him with the comfortable familiarity of long habit, and when he got to the bunkhouse Colton was already there, energized and red-cheeked from the dancing. "I saw you," Colton said immediately. "I saw you dancing with Miss Talbot." "I did," Marcus said, pulling off his boots. Colton made a noise of theatrical disbelief. "You? I've been trying to get you to look at a woman for 3 weeks and you go and dance with the schoolteacher." "Twice," Marcus said. "3 times, counting the first one." Colton stared at him. Then he said, with the reverence usually reserved for feats of physical courage, "Well, good for you, Marcus." Marcus lay back on his bunk and looked at the ceiling and said nothing, and after a while Colton's breathing evened out into sleep, and Marcus lay there in the dark and thought about the way Ada Talbot had said yes, the small hinge of it, the way the word had landed differently than any word had landed in a very long time. Saturday came with a high white sky and a cold wind off the plains. Marcus went into Calico Creek with Earl Putnam to fetch supplies, and the town was busy with the particular business of a Saturday. The post office line spilling out onto the wooden sidewalk, the dry goods store with its door propped open despite the cold, horses tied at every post along the main street. He saw Ada twice, once outside the post office where she collected a small parcel with the efficient manner of someone who had been expecting it, and once near the general store, where she was in conversation with a man Marcus did not recognize, a square-shouldered man in a coat that was too fine for everyday work, who was speaking with the confident posture of someone accustomed to being listened to. Marcus passed without stopping. He was there for supplies, and he had not made any arrangement with Ada Talbot for Saturday, and he had no claim on her time or attention. He picked up the order for Earl Putnam and loaded it onto the wagon and was preparing to leave when he heard his name. Ada was crossing the street toward him, her skirt held up out of the mud, her expression purposeful. "Mr. Reed," she said. "Miss Talbot," he said. "The man I was speaking with," she said, and her voice was the voice of someone delivering a fact, "is named Derek Lane. He is the owner of a parcel of land to the east of town, and he has proposed twice in the last 2 months that I should consider his offer of marriage." Marcus waited. "I have declined both times," she said, "because I have no interest in the matter and because I find him considerably less interesting than he finds himself." Marcus felt the smallest fraction of tension move out of his shoulders. "I am telling you this," Ada continued, "because I noticed you pass without stopping and I thought you might have drawn conclusions." "I might have," he admitted. "Well," she said with the practical directness that he was beginning to understand simply the way she spoke, "now you don't need to." She started to turn back toward the sidewalk and then paused. "There is a social at the church hall 2 weeks from Sunday. Not a dance, a supper. The Ladies' Auxiliary organizes it every autumn for the benefit of the schoolhouse." "I've heard of it," Marcus said, which was almost true, since Colton had mentioned something of the sort in passing. "If you were intending to attend," Ada said, with the careful syntax of a woman who is not quite inviting but is not quite not inviting, "I expect I will be there as well, given that it is nominally for the benefit of my institution." "I expect I will attend," Marcus said. Ada nodded. It was the nod of a woman who has conveyed what she intended to convey and considers the matter settled. She went back across the street and Marcus watched her go and then looked at Patience, who was tied to the post and regarding him with an expression of equine neutrality. "Don't say anything," he told the horse, and climbed onto the wagon seat. The 2 weeks between the Saturday encounter and the church supper were busy with the particular work of late autumn on a Texas ranch. The calves that had been brought in needed branding and sorting, and 2 sections of fence on the eastern boundary had come down in a windstorm that blew through on a Wednesday night with the dramatic urgency of a thing that has been gathering strength for weeks. Marcus worked from first light to last light most days, and at night he was tired in the clean, uncomplicated way that outdoor work produces, the kind of tiredness that is actually a form of satisfaction. He was aware that he was looking forward to the church supper. He noted this fact about himself with the cautious attention of a man examining something fragile. He had not looked forward to a social event in 11 years. He had attended them occasionally, as a man will, because the alternative of total isolation has its own costs, but he had attended them the way he took medicine, as a necessary unpleasantness, not as something anticipated with anything resembling pleasure. He thought about Ada more than he had a logical reason to. He thought about the way she had said no and then, when he asked again, said yes. He thought about the way she had crossed the street on Saturday to correct his possible misapprehension about Derek Lane. He thought about the small crescent scar near her left eyebrow, which she had given him no information about, and which suggested a story he did not know. He found himself thinking about a leaner less, and then feeling guilty about thinking about a leaner less, and then recognizing the guilt as the self-punishing habit of a man who had built a private shrine out of his grief and had spent 11 years tending it in the dark. Eleanor had been 23 when she died. She had died of a fever in New Mexico in the summer of 1871, 12 years ago now. They had been married for 2 years, and he had loved her with the whole and uncomplicated love of a young man who had never had a reason to be careful with his heart. After she died, being careful with his heart had seemed like the only rational response to the evidence the world had provided. He was 34 now. Eleanor had been gone for 12 years. She would have turned 35 in December, and the fact that he knew this and had kept track of it for 12 years told him something about the precise nature of his grief, which was not the grief of a man who had moved on but the grief of a man who had stayed in one place so long the ground had grown around his feet. On the Sunday of the supper, he put on his best shirt, which was a dark blue cotton that had been washed so many times it had faded to a particular shade that Colton called almost navy. He combed his hair. He looked at himself in the small mirror above the bunkhouse washstand with the critical assessment of a man who knows the territory but is aware it may not present well to others. He was not a handsome man in the conventional sense. He was a man whose face showed the weather and the years, which was the same face as most men his age in this part of the country. But there was something in the eyes that he had been told, once, a long time ago, was worth looking at, and he hoped that was still true. The church supper was held in the hall adjacent to the First Methodist Church of Calico Creek, a whitewashed building that served also as the meeting place for the town council, the site of the occasional itinerant preacher's revival, and once, memorably, the overflow space for a cattle dispute that had grown too heated for the smaller confines of the sheriff's office. Tonight it was strung with paper lanterns that the schoolchildren had made, and the long tables were set with the combined efforts of approximately 15 women who had been cooking since Friday. Marcus arrived with Earl Putnam and Earl's wife, Clara, who was a kind woman of 50, with the patient manner of someone who has raised 4 boys and survived it. Clara had said nothing to Marcus about Ada Talbot, for which he was grateful, though he had caught a certain knowing quality in her expression when he had asked about the supper's arrangements. The hall was already half full when they arrived, and the smell was extraordinary. The particular combination of roasted meat and fresh bread and apple pie and wood smoke that belonged specifically to community suppers in 1882 and nowhere else in the world. He found Ada almost immediately. She was at the far end of the hall, standing beside a table of desserts, and speaking with an older woman he recognized as the minister's wife, and she was wearing a different dress from the tobacco-colored one. This one, a dark green that suited her complexion in a way that made him aware of it without being able to entirely explain why. She saw him at almost the same moment, and the acknowledgment that passed between them was quiet and private. Just the meeting of eyes and a slight change of expression that managed to convey recognition, and something warmer without being visible to the room in any way that would have invited comment. They were seated at different tables for the supper, as the arrangement went, and Marcus ate and talked with the people around him, who were a rancher named Holt and his wife, and a man from the land office who had opinions about the railroad and expressed them at considerable length. He was a sufficient participant in the conversation while also being aware, in a sideways, peripheral manner, of Ada across the room, the way she tilted her head when someone said something that required consideration, the way she laughed at something the minister's wife said, a genuine laugh that was not the performing laugh of a woman laughing because it was expected of her. After supper, when the tables had been pushed back and the lanterns made the hall feel warm and close in the good way, people circulated, and Marcus found himself standing near the dessert table with a piece of apple pie. He was eating without any memory of having obtained it when Ada appeared at his elbow. "The pie is very good," she said. "Martha Holt makes it every year and everyone pretends they don't know her secret is that she adds a small amount of bourbon." "I can taste it," Marcus said. "Most people can," Ada said. "Nobody mentions it because then they'd have to admit they've been eating bourbon pie at a Methodist church supper." He laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of him, and Ada watched it happen with the expression of someone who has accomplished something they were not certain they could accomplish. "You don't laugh often," she said. "I don't," he agreed. "Why not?" It was a direct question, asked in the direct way she had of asking things without pretense or softening. He thought about deflecting and then decided that deflecting was the behavior of a man who was still living inside his grief like a house, and he had spent enough time there. "I was married," he said. "My wife died in 1871. After that, things stopped being amusing for a while, and then the while became a habit." Ada was quiet for a moment. The hall moved around them, conversations and laughter and the scrape of chairs, and she was quiet in the middle of it. "I am sorry," she said, and she said it the way people say it when they mean it and not as a formality. "It was a long time ago," he said. "That doesn't always help," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said, "it doesn't always." She looked back at him with the frank steadiness that he was learning was simply how she inhabited herself. "What was her name?" she asked. "Eleanor," he said, and saying the name here in this hall to this woman felt different than it usually did. It felt like setting something down that had been carried too long in one position. "She must have been remarkable," Ada said. "She was," Marcus said. And then, because it was honest, and because Ada seemed to require honesty in the same way a room requires air, he said, "She would have been very impatient with 11 years of me being miserable on her behalf." "I expect she would," Ada said, and there was warmth in it, and a kind of permission in the warmth. They talked for a long time that night. They found the particular rhythm that good conversation between two people has when both are intelligent and both have learned to be careful but are choosing, for reasons neither could fully articulate, to be less careful than usual. She told him about Haskell and her father's farm and the series of decisions, mostly made under duress, that had brought her to Calico Creek. He told her about the years before the Putnam Ranch, the trail work, the drifting, the long way around that a man takes when he is not heading anywhere in particular. He did not tell her about the worst years. There would be time for that, or there would not, but not tonight. Derek Lane arrived late in the evening, and Marcus saw him across the room. A man of perhaps 40 with the well-fed solidity of someone who had done well in land, and did not let anyone forget it. He watched Lane make his way through the room with the natural assumption of welcome that money provides, and saw the moment Lane spotted Ada an altered course. Marcus was aware of a feeling in his chest that he identified as territorial, and then recognized as the specific kind of feeling that a man who has stopped caring about anything gets when he starts caring about something again. It was not comfortable. It was, in its discomfort, enormously informative. Lane spoke to Ada briefly, and she responded with the polite and entirely closed manner of a woman who is making it clear that the conversation has a known and proximate end. Lane smiled the smile of a man who has not heard no enough times for it to fully register, and moved on to greet other people with the assurance of a man of property and prospects. Ada returned to Marcus with the brisk air of a woman who has disposed of an inconvenience and returned to the interesting thing. "He asked if I had considered his proposal," she said, without preamble. "And," Marcus said, "I told him that I had considered it approximately as long as it took to understand what he was asking, which was not long." Marcus felt the tension that had briefly occupied his chest release. "He doesn't seem like a man who hears no easily," he said. "He does not," Ada agreed. "He believes that persistence in the face of refusal is a form of devotion. I find it a form of discourtesy." "It is," Marcus said. She looked at him then in a way that was direct even by her own considerable standards of directness. "You asked me twice," she said. "The night we danced, but the second time was different." "Was it?" he said, though he knew what she meant. "You asked if you could ask again," she said. "You gave me the deciding of it. That's a different thing entirely." He understood that she was telling him something important, drawing a line between the kind of asking that respects the answer and the kind that simply continues until the answer changes out of exhaustion. He understood that she had given him something by saying yes, something that had been given freely and not extracted. "It matters," he said, "that you get to decide." "It does," she said, and the way she said it told him that not everyone in her life had agreed with this, and that the ones who hadn't had cost her something. They stayed until the lanterns were burning low and most of the hall had emptied, And when they finally walked out into the cool night air, it was with the slightly dazed quality of two people who have spent several hours in close conversation and are only now returning to the world that existed before the conversation. He walked her to the edge of the churchyard where the road split toward the schoolhouse. "I would like to call on you," he said, "if you're agreeable." Ada stood in the dark with the stars very bright over the flat Texas landscape, and she looked at him with the expression that was her version of considering, the tilted attention of a woman who does nothing by default. "Tuesday evening," she said. "I will be home by 5. You are welcome to call then." He said good night, and she said good night, and he walked back to the wagon where Earl and Clara were waiting with the patient forbearance of people who had correctly anticipated a delay. Clara said nothing, but she was smiling. He called on Tuesday. He brought nothing except himself, which felt audacious and was probably correct. He knocked on the door of the small house beside the schoolhouse, and Ada opened it wearing an apron and with a streak of something that looked like flour on her left cheekbone, and she looked briefly surprised and then merely pleased and stepped back to let him in. "I was making bread," she said. "It's a Tuesday habit. Come in." The house was small, and he had to be somewhat careful with his dimensions moving through it, but it was arranged with the unsentimental care of a woman who had made the best of a limited space. There were books on every flat surface that could support them. There was a photograph on the wall beside the window of a man and a woman he did not recognize but took to be her parents. There was a gray cat with one ear who came and sat in the precise center of the room and regarded Marcus with the affronted dignity of a creature whose domestic arrangements were being disrupted. "That is Biscuit," Ada said, returning to her dough. "He looks suspicious," Marcus said. "He is always suspicious," Ada said. "He was found in a barn fire outside Haskell, and he has never forgiven the world for it. But he will tolerate you eventually if you don't try to move him." Marcus sat down at the kitchen table and watched Ada work, which was a thing he had not done in 11 years, sat in a woman's kitchen and watched her make bread, and the ordinary domesticity of it moved through him with a warmth that was almost painful in its unfamiliarity. Biscuit eventually crossed the room and sat on Marcus's boot, which Ada said was an extraordinary honor that had been extended to almost no one in the cat's living memory. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him about the morning's lessons, about a dispute between two of the older boys that had been theatrical in its intensity and trivial in its cause. He told her about the fence repair, about a hawk he had seen that morning sitting on a post so still it had looked like it had been placed there by someone's deliberate intention. She asked him about New Mexico, and he told her about it honestly, the country and the years there and a leaner, and this time he told it with the ease of something that has been looked at long enough to be understood. She listened without filling the pauses. When he left an hour and a half later, she said, "Next Tuesday." And he said, "Next Tuesday," and rode back to the Putnam Ranch in the dark with the feeling of a man who has found something he had stopped looking for. The Tuesdays became a reliable thing. He came at 5, she was home. Biscuit established himself on his boot with the proprietary confidence of early arrangement, and they talked, and she made things in the kitchen, and sometimes he fixed things. A door hinge that had been pulling loose from the frame, a window that no longer latched properly against the wind, small repairs that were his way of saying what he was not yet saying with words. She knew what he was saying. Ada Talbot was many things, and obtuse was not among them. One Tuesday in November, when the wind was coming down off the plains with serious intent and rattling the windows of her small house with a sound like something demanding entry, she said, "Tell me about the years between Alina and here." He looked at his hands on the table. He told her. Not all of it, not the worst corner of it, but enough. The years of trail driving along the Kishom and the good night-loving routes. The year in Arizona that he preferred not to revisit too closely. The stretches of time in which his best quality had been the absence of active self-destruction, which was not nothing but was not much either. She listened with the quality of listening that made you feel that what you were saying was being truly received and not merely catalogued. "What stopped it?" she asked. "The drifting." "A man I worked with was killed," he said. "Not violently. He just got sick on a winter drive and he died 3 days later, and nobody knew his name except what he'd told us, which may or may not have been true. He died without anyone who knew him. I thought if I died tomorrow it would be the same." And I decided that was enough of that. Ada was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And so you came to Calico Creek." "And so I came to Calico Creek," he agreed. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly over his, a single, deliberate gesture, and then withdrew it and went back to her tea, and Marcus sat with the warmth of that brief contact spreading up his arm in a way that was disproportionate to its duration. In December, the weather turned hard. The high plains in winter had a particular brutality that was not the dramatic brutality of mountains, but the grinding, relentless cold of open country, wind that found every gap in every wall and made indoor life a matter of constant small maintenance. Marcus worked through it, the way you did, with the resigned endurance of someone who knows the season is finite even when it does not feel so. He went to town when he could. There were some Saturdays when the road was bad enough that Earl Putnam preferred to keep everyone on the ranch, and those days Marcus spent with the particular impatience of a man who has somewhere he would rather be. He wrote a letter on one of those Saturdays, the first letter he had written to a woman since Alina, and sat for a long time looking at what he had written with the critical eye of a man who is not certain he has said the right things, and then sent it anyway, because not sending it was the action of a man still living in the closed house of his grief, and he was trying very hard not to be that man anymore. Ada wrote back. She wrote with the same direct, observational quality she had in speech, and her letters were full of the ordinary details of the school and the town and Biscuit's ongoing personality disputes with the world, and at the end of the second letter she wrote, in her clean, precise hand, "I find that I look forward to Tuesdays more than any other day of the week, and I wanted you to know that." He read this sentence 4 times. Then he folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket and went back to work. Christmas came and went with the modest celebrations appropriate to a working ranch and a small frontier town. The church held a service, and Ada read one of the lessons, standing at the front of the small congregation with the composed attention she brought to everything, and Marcus sat in the third pew and was aware that he was watching her with an expression that was probably visible to everyone within his immediate vicinity. Colton, seated beside him, nudged him once with his elbow. Marcus ignored it with dignity. After the service, in the churchyard where people were exchanging the seasonal courtesies, Marcus found himself beside Ada and gave her the small gift he had made, which was a bookcase, the kind with small shelves, made from a piece of cedar wood from the ranch and smoothed, and fitted with the careful work of a man who does not have money to spend but has hands and time. He had worried it was too much or not enough, or that she would find it presumptuous. She looked at it for a long moment and he could not read her expression, and then she looked up at him with something in her eyes that was brighter than usual, and she said, "It's exactly right." January was cold and white and long. In the deep core of the winter, on a Tuesday when the roads were clear enough to ride, but cold enough to make the ride an act of commitment, Marcus arrived at Ada's door at his usual hour, and she opened it with the expression of someone who has been thinking about something specific and is ready to speak about it. They sat at the kitchen table, and she made coffee, the real kind, which she saved for particular occasions, and which told him something about the category this evening had been placed in. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "I will," he said. "What are you intending toward me?" she said. It was the most direct question he had ever been asked by a person who was not in a legal dispute with him. He looked at her, at the auburn hair and the crescent scar and the straightforward intelligence in her expression, and he thought about the easy answer, which was the courtly, managed answer that men gave women in 1882, and he discarded it. "I am intending to love you," he said, "if you'll let me, for the rest of whatever time I have." The kitchen was very quiet. Biscuit, from his position on the chair in the corner, watched with one-eared attention. Ada looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I have been alone for a long time, not unhappily. I made something good here on my own terms, and I am not willing to give that up." "I am not asking you to," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I am telling you this, because the men who do ask me to give it up do not usually understand why I am saying no to them. You understand why, that is the difference." He waited. "I am not a woman who does things by half," she said. "If I let you love me, I will love you back completely, and I am not going to apologize for that." "I would not want you to," he said. She picked up her coffee. She looked at the table and then at him, and the expression that arrived was the one that started deep before it reached her face, the real one. "All right then," she said. "Let us not waste any more of the winter sitting on opposite sides of this table." He moved his chair around, and she did not move away, and the kitchen was warm and the wind was outside, and Biscuit put his one good ear up in a manner that suggested tentative approval. He asked Earl Putnam's permission, as was proper, not because Earl had any authority over the matter, but because Earl was a fair man and a good employer, and Marcus respected him enough to do it right. Earl said yes, and Clara cried in the happy way that women with 4 boys cry when something romantic presents itself, and Colton made a noise of triumphant vindication that could be heard from across the barn. He asked Ada in February, on a Tuesday, with a ring he had ordered through the mail from a catalog, a simple silver ring with a small garnet that he had chosen because it was the color of her hair in certain light. He got down on one knee on the floor of her kitchen, which was drafty and cold from the February air coming under the door, and he said her name, and she looked at him with the bright-eyed attention of the moment, and he asked her. She said yes. Not the way she had said yes to the dance, with the slight deliberation of a woman making a considered choice, though there was that in it too. She said yes with her whole self behind it, the kind of yes that has a physical weight, and she pulled him up from the floor by both hands and held his face in her palms and said, "Do not disappear on me, Marcus Reed." "I am done disappearing," he said. "Good," she said, and kissed him for the first time, which was something that had been becoming increasingly inevitable for several months, and which was, when it arrived, both exactly as anticipated and nothing like what he had imagined, the way the important things usually are. They were married in April, when the Texas plains were briefly, exuberantly green, and the wildflowers were doing the spectacular thing they did every spring before the heat came and ended the performance. The minister of the First Methodist Church performed the ceremony, and the hall was full, because the town of Calico Creek had been watching this particular development unfold with the collective interest of a small community that considers its members' lives a shared concern. Ada wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from a catalog in San Antonio, a pale cream cotton with small embroidered flowers at the collar, and she wore her hair up in the way she always wore it, but with 2 small flowers tucked into the arrangement, which was the single concession to decoration she allowed herself, and it was perfect. Marcus stood at the front of the hall and watched her come down the short aisle on her father's arm, Silas Talbot having ridden 2 days from Haskell for the occasion, a weathered man with his daughter's eyes and the slightly dazed expression of a man who knows he raised something remarkable but is not entirely sure how. When she arrived beside Marcus and looked up at him, the expression on her face was the one that started deep, and he thought that if he could keep being the reason for that expression for the rest of his life, he would have done something worthwhile with the time he'd been given. They said their vows with the direct, unhesitating quality that both of them brought to things that mattered. Marcus's voice was steady and Ada's was steady, and the minister looked briefly moved, which was not his usual expression. Colton Putnam, seated in the second row, was making valiant efforts to maintain composure and not entirely succeeding. The celebration afterward was a proper one, with Roberto Cruz and his musicians providing the music, because Ada had specifically requested it, and Marcus danced every dance with her, and did not hold back from it, did not measure out his movement with the careful rationing of a man who is protecting himself, but danced with the whole commitment of a man who has decided that the closed house is no longer his residence. Earl Putnam said, raising a glass of the good whiskey he had brought for the occasion, "I have watched this man for 6 months, and I have never seen him look like he looks tonight. So here's to the woman who managed it." Ada, accepting the toast, said, "He managed himself. I just gave him a reason." They danced long past when most people had gone home, in the nearly empty hall with Roberto Cruz playing for the love of it, with the lanterns burning low and the Texas night cool outside the windows, and Marcus held her and thought about Alina, briefly and honestly, the way you think about the people who are part of you, and thought, she would have liked this. She would have wanted this for me. And he let that be true without the guilt. Ada pressed her face against his shoulder and said quietly into the fabric of his shirt, "What are you thinking?" "That I am very glad I asked again," he said. She pulled back enough to look at him. "So am I," she said. They moved to a small house in town that was larger than Ada's schoolhouse accommodation, with an extra room and a kitchen with a proper stove, and a porch that faced east and caught the morning sun. Marcus continued to work for Earl Putnam, but as a senior hand with the particular status of a married man, which came with slightly better hours and slightly more autonomy. And Ada continued to teach, because she had made it clear from the beginning that she would not stop, and Marcus had not asked her to. They made their life together with the unsentimental competence of two people who had been building things alone long enough to know how the work was done, and found that building together was not only easier, but had a quality that working alone never had, which was that at the end of the day, there was someone to show what you'd built. The spring turned into summer, and summer into the fall of 1883, and Calico Creek continued its stubborn existence on the edge of the Llano Estacado. The railroad that the man from the land office had opinions about was indeed coming, slowly and argumentatively, and there were long discussions in the Golden Spur and the town hall about what it would mean, who would benefit and who would be displaced. And Marcus listened to these discussions with the attention of a man who knows that the railroad has a way of reorganizing the world it arrives in, for better and worse in roughly equal measure. There were injustices in the world around them that could not be ignored, and that Marcus and Ada did not ignore. The Comanche and Kiowa peoples who had lived on the Llano Estacado for generations had been forcibly removed to reservations in the years before Marcus arrived, the Red River War of 1874 having ended the last free life on the southern plains, and what remained was the land the ranchers now ran cattle on, rich grassland that had once sustained the great buffalo herds and was now sustaining something entirely different. Marcus had ridden through the aftermath of this in his drifting years, and had understood it for what it was, which was the machinery of a nation taking what it wanted from people who had no mechanism to stop it. Ada taught the children of Calico Creek with the materials available to her, and she was honest with them, in the way that a good teacher is honest, about the history of the land they lived on, which did not always match the story that was easier to tell. This occasionally caused friction with some of the town's fathers, who had their own relationship with that history and preferred not to have it examined in the schoolroom. Ada examined it anyway, with the quiet, immovable persistence of a woman who believes that children deserve truth. Marcus backed her in this, publicly and privately, which was not without its own costs in a town where most of the men whose opinions shaped things had a different view. But Marcus had been on enough of the country, had seen enough of what had been done and what it had cost, to be clear in his own conscience about what side of the thing he stood on. Derrick Lane made one more approach in the autumn of 1883, catching Ada outside the schoolhouse with the manner of a man who has decided that a husband is merely a revision to the problem, rather than a solution to it. He suggested, with the brazenness that substantial property can sometimes produce in a man, that circumstances could change, and that his offer remained open in spirit if not in its original form. Ada looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was very quiet in the way that very serious things are quiet. She said, "Mr. Lane, I am going to say something to you clearly enough that it does not need repeating. I am Marcus Reed's wife, and he is my husband, and I would not alter that arrangement for anything in the world, including whatever you are suggesting. Now I would ask you to leave the grounds of this school because it is a place where children learn, and what you are modeling for them right now is not something I want them to witness." Lane left. He did not approach again. When Marcus heard about it that evening, Ada told it in the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a minor administrative matter that had been handled. Marcus listened and then said, "I would have been considerably less articulate." "I know," she said. "That's why it's better that I handled it." He laughed. The real laugh, the kind that surprised him still, the kind that had been missing for so long that its return was always faintly startling. In November of 1883, Ada told him that she was expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday evening, though Tuesday evenings had long since ceased to be the occasion of anything formal and had simply become Tuesday evenings with all the domestic ordinariness that implied, and she told him while he was doing something unremarkable, checking something at the stove, and she said his name and he turned and she told him. He stood very still for a moment. The kitchen was warm and the lamp was burning and Biscuit was in his chair, and everything in the room continued exactly as it was, but the world had shifted in some fundamental arrangement. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her face in his hands and said, "Ada," she said, "I know." He laughed and then he had to stop because his eyes were doing something unexpected, which was producing tears, the first tears in 8 years, and he was briefly embarrassed. And then he stopped being embarrassed because Ada was holding his face the way he was holding hers and saying, "Don't you dare be embarrassed, Marcus Reed." "I'm not," he said, and he was lying and they both knew it, and she kissed him anyway. The pregnancy was ordinary and uncomplicated in the way that good fortune presents itself as simply the way things are. Ada continued teaching well into the winter, declining to be inconvenienced, and the school board had opinions about this that she declined to receive. She finished the school term in late March of 1884, and their son was born in May, on a warm spring morning when the mockingbirds were doing their spectacular competitive performance in the trees near the schoolhouse. They named him James Silas Reed. James for Marcus's brother, who had died 20 years earlier and who had been the best person Marcus had known as a young man. Silas for Ada's father, who arrived from Haskell 2 days later, and held his grandson with the dazed reverence of a man to whom something has been given beyond his ordinary expectation of the world. James Silas Reed was a dark-haired, loud-voiced fact of 8 pounds and 7 ounces who arrived in the world with the conviction that it owed him something, and set about claiming it immediately. He had his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and the specific, unified energy of a child, who is completely themselves from the very first moment. Biscuit regarded the new arrival from across the room with the profound skepticism of a creature whose domestic arrangements have been disrupted for the second time. He eventually came around, as he had with Marcus, and by the time James was sitting up and reaching for things, Biscuit had established himself as a permissive and somewhat bewildered companion, submitting to small-handed indignities with the resigned dignity of an old soldier. Marcus held his son on the porch in the evenings when the summer light came flat and golden across the plains, and felt things for which he had no words, the particular wordless enormity of love for something entirely dependent and entirely itself. He talked to James about the sky and the land and the birds, and James listened with the absolute confidence of an infant who assumes that whatever is being said is specifically for him. Ada recovered quickly, as she did everything quickly, and when September came, she returned to the schoolhouse with James installed in a small corner she had arranged with a crib and a blanket, where he slept through most of the morning lessons with the cooperative spirit of a child raised in a classroom. The school board had opinions about this as well. Ada listened to them and installed the crib anyway. The town of Calico Creek grew through 1884 and into 1885. The railroad came within 15 miles of them, close enough to change the economics of cattle shipping without fundamentally altering the character of the town, which was a fortunate middle ground that not every Texas town achieved. New families arrived and some old ones left, as the frontier always reshuffled itself, looking for the next edge. Marcus was promoted, in the loosely organized sense that ranch work permits promotion, to something approaching a foreman's role at the Putnam spread, overseeing the work of 6 other hands and managing the logistics of the operation with the practical efficiency of a man who had spent enough years doing every part of the work to understand how all the parts fit together. Earl Putnam, who was getting older and whose knees gave him trouble in cold weather, was glad of the arrangement, and Clara was glad of it in the way that showed in the extra servings she deposited on Marcus's plate at Sunday suppers, which were a regular fixture of life now. Colton had married the laundry girl, whose name was Nancy, and who was even more cheerful than Colton on his best days, and their domestic life had the bouncing, enthusiastic quality you might have predicted. Their first child was due in spring of 1885, and Colton had taken to following Marcus around with a new quality of deference, as a man who is about to enter territory looks to someone who has been there. Does it change everything? Colton asked him one evening in the barn, brushing down his horse with the energy of a man working off anxiety. Yes, Marcus said. Is that good? Marcus thought about the morning light on James's face, about the way Ada looked when she was feeding their son, about the ordinary evening on the porch that had become his entire definition of a good life. It is the best thing, he said. Colton exhaled. Good, he said. That's good. On the 2nd anniversary of their wedding, in April of 1885, Marcus and Ada sat on the porch in the evening light, the kind of evening that the Texas spring produces briefly before the heat claims the season, with James asleep inside, and the mockingbirds doing their performance in the trees, and the sky going through its full range of orange and rose and deep blue above the flat horizon. Ada had her head on his shoulder and he had his arm around her, and neither of them was saying anything, because there are kinds of happiness that are large enough to be quiet in. After a long time, Ada said, 2 years. 2 years, he agreed. Are you glad? She asked. She asked it not with insecurity but with the genuine curiosity of a woman who values honesty enough to keep asking for it. He turned and looked at her, at the auburn hair going slightly loose from its pinning in the evening warmth, at the crescent scar he still had not asked about, at the expression that was the one that started deep. Ada, he said. I stood at the edge of a dance floor for 11 years because I thought the part of me that could be glad was finished. You said no and I asked again and you said yes, and it was the most important yes of my entire life. He stopped because words were a limited instrument and what he was trying to say was larger than the available vocabulary. I am glad every single day, even the cold ones. She laughed against his shoulder. Even the cold ones, she repeated. Even the cold ones, he confirmed. She sat up and looked at him in the fading light. I was not expecting you, she said. I had decided I was not expecting anyone. I had built a very reasonable life. You had, he agreed. And then you came and stood next to me at the bar and asked if I wanted to dance, and I said no because I was being careful, and you asked again. And something in the way you asked again was different from every other man who had ever pressed on after a no, and that is the reason I said yes. What was different? He asked, because he had wondered. She thought about it. She was quiet for a moment with the quality she had of giving things their proper consideration. You were asking me, she said. Not insisting on yourself. There is a difference. Most men who ask again are insisting on themselves. You were still asking me. The no mattered to you. That was the thing. He held that for a moment. Then he said, "The no should always matter." "It should," she said, "and it matters that you know it." The stars were coming out over Calico Creek, the same stars that had been there the night he had stood at the door of the Golden Spur and felt something shift in the world's arrangements. They were very bright and very close, the way they were over open country, and the town was quiet below them, the particular quiet of a place that has done its day's work and laid itself down. James made a sound from inside, not the wake-up sound but the shifting sound of a healthy sleeping child rearranging himself, and both of them tilted their heads slightly toward it with the automatic parental attention that needs no thought. It was quiet again. Marcus thought about Llano, briefly and lovingly, the way he had learned to, not with the weight of grief but with the tenderness of memory, the way you hold something precious you no longer carry but have not forgotten. He thought she would have found Ada remarkable. He thought she would have been right. He pulled Ada a little closer, and she settled against him with the ease of 2 years of learning each other's particular geometries. And the sky above the Llano Estacado was enormous and brilliant and entirely indifferent to the small, warm world on the porch below it. By the summer of 1885, Ada had confirmed that she was expecting their second child, a fact she delivered with the same direct calm she brought to everything, and which Marcus received with marginally more preparation this time, though the enormity of it still required a moment of silent processing before he could respond. "March?" he asked. "Approximately," she said. He kissed her. She smiled into it. The school had grown that year, 3 new families having arrived in Calico Creek and brought their children with them, and Ada had put in a formal request to the school board for an additional teacher. The school board deliberated in the manner of bodies that have opinions about expense, and Ada attended their meeting and made the case with the organized clarity of a woman who has been preparing arguments since the age of 7, and the additional teacher was approved, a young woman named Dorothy Crane who arrived from Abilene in September and who was, Ada reported that evening with genuine satisfaction, exactly the right person. "She is 10 years younger than me and twice as energetic," Ada said, "and she has already organized the older students in a way that I have been meaning to do for a year." "You like her," Marcus said. "Enormously," Ada said. "She reminds me of myself at 17, which is terrifying and wonderful in equal measure." James was growing with the enthusiastic speed of a child who has a great deal of world to process and is setting about it without delay. He was walking by now, a sturdy, determined walk that was immediately purposeful, as if every destination he set out for was one he had been planning to reach for some time. He had Marcus's way of being quiet in rooms, observing before engaging, and Ada's way of engaging completely once he decided to, so that conversations with James Silas Reed, aged 15 months, were conducted at the level of intensity you might expect from a state negotiation. Biscuit had accepted his lot. He slept on James's blanket at the foot of the crib with the air of an animal who has decided that if you cannot beat the new arrangement you might as well supervise it. Silas Talbot came to visit again in September, staying 2 weeks in the spare room and spending most of his time on the porch watching James systematically reorganize everything within his reach. Silas had sold the Haskell farm at last, a decision that had been building for years, and was considering a smaller piece of land closer to Calico Creek, which was an idea that Ada received with the particular expression of a woman who loves her father and is also very aware of his personality. Marcus liked Silas. Silas was a quiet man with large hands and the unhurried manner of someone who has made peace with most of what life has handed him. He and Marcus sat on the porch in the evenings and talked about land and weather and cattle and the coming railroad and the way the country was changing, the slow, practical conversation of men who work with their hands and have their own philosophy about it. On the last evening of Silas's visit, when Ada had put James to bed and come back out to sit with them, Silas looked at the two of them in the evening light and said, "I did not know what I was expecting when she went off to be a schoolteacher in a place I'd never been. I did not know what kind of life she'd find. Marcus and Ada waited. Silas said, "This is better than anything I expected." Ada leaned over and put her head on her father's shoulder for a moment, and he put his arm around her and patted her arm in the awkward, heartfelt manner of a father who has not been demonstrative but means everything by the gesture. Marcus looked at the sky over Calico Creek and felt the fullness of it, the specific, concrete fullness of a life that is actually being lived. The second child, a boy they named Thomas William Reed, arrived in March of 1886 on a cold afternoon when the last of the winter was making its reluctant departure, and the first green was beginning in the grass on the south-facing slopes. He arrived faster and louder than his brother, announcing himself with the vigorous immediacy of someone who has no interest in quiet entrances. And James, now approaching his second birthday, stood at the bedroom doorway with the grave expression of a child processing a very large piece of information. Marcus brought James in to see his brother, holding him carefully, and James looked at Thomas William Reed for a long time with the concentrated attention of a scientist examining an anomaly. Then he reached out one small hand and patted his brother's head very gently and looked up at Marcus with an expression of cautious provisional acceptance. "Good man," Marcus said. Colton and Nancy's daughter had been born in early 1885, a small, fierce person named Clara after Earl's wife, who had been deeply pleased by the honor. The two households were close in the way that good neighbors can become family through proximity and genuine affection, and Sunday suppers at the Putnam Ranch had become a standing arrangement with enough people around the table to constitute a small company. On a Sunday in the summer of 1886, with Thomas William 3 months old and James investigating the ranch yard with the systematic energy that was becoming his defining characteristic, Marcus stood at the fence of the Putnam property and looked out at the grass, the same grass that stretched to the horizon in every direction, the same high plain that had been here before any of them and would be here after, and felt something he could only call gratitude, though that word was inadequate to the scale of the thing. He had been afraid in those 11 years of not asking, not dancing, not reaching toward anything, that the capacity for this kind of feeling had been used up, expended in his grief for a leaner, and then simply calcified over in the long, quiet years. He had been afraid that he was, functionally, a man who had already lived his emotional life and was now merely continuing. He had been wrong, and being wrong had never felt so much like being rescued. Ada came out of the ranch house with Thomas William against her shoulder and James trotting alongside her, and she crossed the yard toward him with the ease of a woman moving through her own life, and Marcus turned from the fence and watched her come. She reached him and stood beside him and looked out at the same grass he had been looking at, and Thomas William made the small sounds of a fed and comfortable infant, and James sat down in the dirt with the immediate purposefulness of a child who has found something interesting at the junction of the fence post and the ground. "What are you thinking?" Ada asked. "That I am very glad," Marcus said. She turned and looked at him with the bright, real expression that was hers and only hers, the one that started from somewhere deep and traveled up and arrived with the weight of everything it had passed through on the way. "So am I," she said. Roberto Cruz played at the Golden Spur the following October, the third Thursday, the way he had been playing there for years, and Marcus and Ada went, with Clara Putnam watching the boys and shaking her head fondly at the door as they left. The hall was the same. The lanterns were the same. The fiddle sang the same question and answer it always sang. Marcus stood at the edge of the floor with Ada beside him instead of across the room, and he looked at her and she looked at him and he said, "Would you dance with me?" She smiled. The smile that had to travel. "Yes," she said. And he took her hand, and they went out onto the floor of the Golden Spur, and Roberto Cruz played something that sounded like a story with a good ending. And they danced, the two of them, with nothing careful or measured about it, with the complete and easy commitment of people who have chosen each other fully and found the choosing to be the most right thing they have ever done. The Llano Estacado stretched out beyond the walls of the Golden Spur, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. And inside the saloon, two people moved through the light as if they had always been doing this, as if the 11 years of silence and the careful asking, and the no and the second asking, and the yes had been the exact right path to this specific place, which is what every good story is in the end, a long way around to exactly where you needed to be. James grew into the serious, curious boy the early signs had promised, and Thomas into a loud and joyful counterpoint to his brother, and Biscuit lived to a dignified old age and died in the spring of 1888 on his chair in the kitchen, wrapped in the blanket Ada put over him in his last slow days, and was mourned with genuine feeling by everyone including James, who had never known a world without him. Silas Talbot did buy that small piece of land outside Calico Creek, and he came to Sunday supper most weeks and taught James to whittle and sat with Marcus on the porch in the evenings and talked about the way the country was changing, and he was present and alive and close in a way that Ada had not let herself expect, which was its own kind of grace. Ada taught at the schoolhouse until 1890, by which point Dorothy Crane had become her equal and partner in the work, and the school had grown to 35 children and had a proper second room built onto it by a committee that included Marcus and Colton and several other men who had decided that a good teacher deserved the tools to do good work. She did not stop then, exactly. She became, instead, something slightly different, a woman who taught the town rather than specifically the schoolhouse, who organized the library that was eventually established in 1891, and who had opinions about most things and the credibility to back them. Marcus became, by the middle of the 1890s, as permanent a feature of the Putnam Ranch as the land itself, and when Earl's health finally failed in 1895 and Earl died quietly in his own bed in the autumn, Marcus sat with Clara and held her hand, and helped organize the succession of things with the steadiness of a man who has stood beside something good and will continue standing beside the things it left behind. The ranch continued. The town continued. The children grew. And on Thursday evenings, when the fiddle played at the Golden Spur, Marcus and Ada Reed went out onto the floor together without hesitation, without the careful measuring of a man who has not danced in 11 years, without anything between them and the music except the simple fact of being exactly where they were. The last thing that needed knowing, the final accounting of a story that had begun in 1882 with a man standing at the edge of a dance floor with his hat pressed against his chest, was this: that Marcus Reed was 60 years old in the year of 1908, and Ada was 53, and they had been married for 23 years. And on the occasion of their anniversary that April, James brought his wife and their 2 children from the ranch he had started to the east of Calico Creek, and Thomas brought his particular brand of cheerful disruption from the town where he had taken work in the new bank, and the family gathered on the porch of the house where Ada had her books and her kitchen garden, where Biscuit's old chair still sat in the corner of the kitchen though Biscuit had been gone for 20 years, where the cedar bookcase Marcus had made for Christmas in 1882 was still on the wall, full to overflowing. They ate a good meal, and the children ran in the yard, and the evening came down over the plains in the way it always had, big and orange and indifferent and gorgeous. And Marcus sat beside Ada on the porch, as he had been sitting beside her for 23 years, and she put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the sky went through its colors the way it had always done, and the world was exactly, precisely, more than sufficiently full. He had not asked a woman to dance in 11 years, and she had said no, and he had asked again, and she had said yes, and everything that had come from that second asking, the life and the love and the children and the home and the years, was the answer to the question of whether the asking had been worth it. It had been. It had been worth every one of the 11 years of waiting, every year of the closed house and the calcified grief, every cold morning and long silence and solitary ride across the open country, because all of it had been the long road to a Thursday night in October when a fiddle was playing, and a woman with auburn hair was standing at the bar of the Golden Spur, and he had moved in the wrong direction and found himself close enough to speak. She had said no, and then she had said yes, and the yes had been the beginning of everything.